It was a chilly Tuesday morning, 7:45 a.m. on March 3, 2025. The world was still buzzing about the latest tech gadgets, and people were debating whether pineapple belonged on pizza. Just another normal day. But for Dr. Elena Carter, it was anything but normal. I remember walking into the hospital that morning, the place already alive with the hum of activity. Nurses rushing, patients waiting, and the faint smell of antiseptic in the air. Dr. Carter, though? She was in her element. She wasn't just any doctor, she was the kind of person who made you feel like you were the only one in the room, even in the chaos of the ER. I watched her move from patient to patient, her voice calm, her hands steady. She had this way of making people feel safe, even when things were scary. Her colleagues adored her, and honestly, it was hard not to. But here's the thing about Dr. Carter, as much as she gave her all at work, her personal life was a different story. That night, after a long shift, she went home to her teenage daughter, Emma. Emma was sitting on the couch, arms crossed, her face a mix of anger and disappointment. "You missed it, Mum," she said, her voice sharp. Dr. Carter froze. She knew exactly what Emma was talking about, the recital. She'd promised to be there, but the hospital had kept her late again. Later, after Emma had stormed off to her room, Dr. Carter sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. She called her mom, who lived a few towns over. Her mom's voice was warm but tired. They talked briefly about groceries, about the weather, but the call ended too soon, like it always did. Dr. Carter sighed. She loved her family, but balancing everything? It felt impossible. The next day, things started to change. It was subtle at first. A patient came into the ER with a high fever, their skin darkened in patches, almost black, and their lymph nodes swollen like golf balls. Dr. Carter examined them, her brow furrowed. She'd seen a lot in her career, but this was different. By the end of the day, more patients started showing up with the same symptoms. Fever, blackened skin, swollen lymph nodes. It was like something out of a history book, and Dr. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something big was happening. She brought it up in a meeting with the hospital administrators. "We need to act now," she said, her voice firm. "This could be serious." But they waved her off. "It's probably just a bad flu season," one of them said, chuckling. Another added, "Let's not cause unnecessary panic." Dr. Carter left the meeting frustrated, but she couldn't ignore what she was seeing. Something was wrong, and she knew it. It all happened so fast. One moment, life was normal. People going to work, kids playing in parks, the usual hustle and bustle of the city. And then, everything changed. The news reports started rolling in, one after the other. Mysterious illness spreading rapidly. Hospitals overwhelmed. Stay indoors. The streets emptied almost overnight. Shops closed, schools shut down, and the world seemed to hold its breath. But inside the hospital, there was no time to stop and think. It was chaos. Patients flooded in, more than the hospital could handle. The ER was packed wall to wall. Stretchers lining the hallways, people coughing, crying, begging for help. Dr. Carter was in the thick of it, leading her team like a general in battle. She didn't have time to rest, barely had time to think. She was everywhere, checking charts, giving orders, holding hands, and doing everything she could to keep people alive. But then came the hard part. The part no one ever wants to talk about. The hospital was running out of supplies, ventilators, beds, even basic medicine. And Dr. Carter had to make choices. Impossible choices. One night, a young man and an elderly woman both needed the last ventilator. Dr. Carter stood there, her heart pounding, knowing she couldn't save them both. She chose the young man, tears in her eyes as she explained to the woman's family. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. Another time, a family came in, parents and two kids all showing symptoms. Dr. Carter had to decide whether to quarantine them together or separate them to stop the spread. The parents begged her, tears streaming down their faces, "Please, don't take our kids away." But she had no choice. She walked away as the children cried for their mom and dad, her chest heavy with guilt. And while all this was happening, her own life was falling apart. Emma's birthday came and went, and Dr. Carter wasn't there. She'd meant to call, but the day got away from her. Later that night, as she sat in the hospital break room, her head in her hands, she played Emma's voicemail. "Hi, Mom. I guess you're busy again. I wish you were here. I miss you." Dr. Carter closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. She wanted to be there for Emma, but how could she leave when so many people needed her? Her relationships with her loved ones were crumbling. Emma stopped calling as much. Her mom left messages that went unanswered. Dr. Carter felt like she was losing everything, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't walk away. In the middle of all the heartbreak, though, there were moments that reminded her why she kept going. One day, a little boy came in, no older than 6. He was so sick, his tiny body struggling to hold on. Dr. Carter sat by his bed, holding his hand, whispering to him softly. She stayed with him until the end, her heart breaking as he took his last breath. She didn't leave until his parents arrived, hugging them tightly as they cried. Another time, a young nurse named Lila came to her, tears in her eyes. "I can't do this anymore," Lila said, her voice shaking. "It's too much." Dr. Carter put a hand on her shoulder and said, "I know it's hard, but these people need us. You're stronger than you think." Lila nodded, wiping her tears, and went back to work. And then there was the grieving father. His wife was dying, and he couldn't be with her because of the quarantine rules. Dr. Carter set up a video call, holding the tablet so he could say goodbye. "Thank you," he said afterward, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me a chance to say I love you one last time." Moments like these kept her going, even when it felt like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. She was exhausted, heartbroken, and stretched to her limit, but she didn't stop. She couldn't, because in the middle of all the chaos, she knew she was making a difference, and that was enough to keep her moving forward. The hospital was already stretched to its breaking point when the news came. The disease had mutated. It was faster now, more aggressive, and even harder to contain. What little progress they'd made in slowing it down seemed to vanish overnight. Patients who had been stable suddenly got worse. Entire neighborhoods were falling sick within days. It was like trying to hold back a flood with a paper cup. Dr. Carter barely slept anymore. She was working with a team of scientists, poring over data, running tests, and trying to find a way to stop this thing. They were desperate to develop a treatment or, better yet, a vaccine. But time wasn't on their side. Every day, more people died. Every day, the hospital filled with more patients than they could handle. The lab became her second home. She'd spend hours there, staring at microscopes, analyzing blood samples, and brainstorming with the team. They were close, so close, but the virus kept changing, staying one step ahead of them. Dr. Carter knew they were running out of time, but she refused to give up. And then, the unthinkable happened. It was a normal day, or as normal as things could be in the middle of a pandemic. Dr. Carter was treating a patient, a young woman who was struggling to breathe. The woman grabbed Dr. Carter's hand, her eyes wide with fear. "Please," she whispered, "don't let me die." Dr. Carter leaned in close, her voice steady. "I'm here. I won't leave you." But in that moment, as she adjusted the woman's oxygen mask, the patient coughed, a deep, wet cough that sprayed droplets into the air. Dr. Carter froze for a split second, her heart sinking. She knew the risks. She'd been careful, always wearing her protective gear. But sometimes, no matter how careful you were, it wasn't enough. First, she told herself it was nothing. Just exhaustion. Just stress. But a few days later, the fever hit. Her body ached. Her head pounded. And she felt the telltale tightness in her chest. She knew. She didn't need a test to confirm it. She had the disease. Dr. Carter didn't tell anyone at first. She couldn't. The hospital needed her, and there was still so much work to do. So, she pushed through, hiding her symptoms as best she could. She wore extra layers to hide the chills, popped painkillers to keep the fever down, and forced herself to keep going. But her body was failing her, and she knew it was only a matter of time before she couldn't hide it anymore. One night, when the hospital was quiet, she sat alone in her office and turned on her camera. She knew she might not make it, and there were things she needed to say, things she needed the world to hear. Her first message was for Emma. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I'm sorry I haven't been there for you. I wanted to be. I really did. But I hope you know how much I love you. You're the best thing I've ever done, Emma. And I need you to be strong, okay? You're going to do amazing things. I know it." Her second message was for her mom. "Mom, I'm sorry I didn't call more. I know you worried about me, and I know I didn't make it easy. But I love you. Thank you for everything you've done for me, for Emma, for all of us. You're the strongest person I know." And then she recorded a message for the world. She looked straight into the camera, her face pale but determined. "If you're watching this, it means I didn't make it. But that's okay, because it means you did. It means the world kept going. And that's what matters. I know things feel impossible right now. I know it's hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But it's there. It's always there. You just have to keep going. Keep fighting. Keep hoping. The world is worth saving. People are worth saving. Don't ever forget that." She paused, her eyes glistening with tears. "I've seen so much pain, but I've also seen so much love. People coming together, helping each other, even when it's hard. That's what makes us human. That's what makes life beautiful. So don't give up. Not on yourselves, not on each other, and not on this world. It's worth it. I promise." She ended the recording, her hands trembling as she turned off the camera. She sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, her heart heavy but her spirit unbroken. The next day, her symptoms worsened. Her team noticed and they begged her to rest, to let someone else take over. But Dr. Carter shook her head. "Not yet," she said, her voice weak but firm. "There's still work to do." Even as her body betrayed her, her heart never wavered. She kept fighting, not for herself, but for everyone else. Because that's who she was. A fighter. A healer. A beacon of hope in the darkest of times. The hospital was quieter now, but not in a good way. It wasn't the kind of quiet that came with peace. It was the kind of quiet that came with loss. The disease had taken so many, and the ones who were left were barely holding on. Dr. Carter could feel it in the air, the heaviness, the exhaustion, the fear. But she also felt something else. Hope. The team had done it. After weeks of sleepless nights, endless tests, and countless failures, they had finally developed a vaccine. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't a cure, but it was a chance. A chance to stop the disease from spreading. A chance to save lives. The first batch was ready to go, but there was a problem. The quarantine zone, the area where the disease was spreading the fastest, was completely cut off. No one wanted to go in. It was too dangerous. The virus was everywhere, and anyone who entered the zone wasn't expected to come back out. Dr. Carter didn't hesitate. "I'll go," she said, her voice steady. Her team tried to stop her. "You're already sick," one of them said, their voice breaking. "You won't survive this." "I know," she replied, her face calm. "But those people need help. And if I can save even one life, it's worth it." She packed the vaccines herself, loading them into a small cooler. She didn't take much else, just her stethoscope, a few supplies, and the clothes on her back. As she walked toward the quarantine zone, her colleagues stood in silence, watching her go. Some of them were crying. Others were too stunned to speak. The zone was like a ghost town. The streets were empty, the buildings dark. The only sound was the occasional cough or cry from inside the makeshift shelters. Dr. Carter went straight to work, setting up a small clinic in an abandoned school. She started vaccinating people one by one, explaining how it worked, reassuring them that it was safe. The sick came to her in waves, mothers carrying their children, elderly couples holding hands, young men and women too weak to stand. She treated them all, her hands steady even as her body grew weaker. She didn't stop, not even when the fever made her dizzy, not even when the coughing fits left her gasping for air. Word spread quickly. People who had been too afraid to come out of their homes started showing up, desperate for help. Dr. Carter welcomed them all, her voice soft but firm. "We're going to get through this," she told them. "You're not alone." But she knew her time was running out. The disease was taking its toll, and she could feel her strength slipping away. She didn't let it stop her. She kept going, one patient at a time, until every last dose of the vaccine had been given. In her final hours, she sat in the corner of the clinic, her back against the wall. She was too weak to stand, too tired to move. But she wasn't afraid. She looked around at the people she had helped, the lives she had saved, and she felt at peace. A young boy, no older than 10, came up to her. He had been one of the first to receive the vaccine, and his color was already starting to return. He knelt beside her, holding her hand. "Thank you," he whispered, tears in his eyes. Dr. Carter smiled, her voice barely a whisper. "Take care of each other," she said. "That's all that matters." As the sun set over the quarantine zone, Dr. Carter closed her eyes for the last time. She was gone, but her work wasn't. The vaccine she had delivered was already making a difference. The disease was slowing, the spread was stopping, and people were starting to heal. Back at the hospital, her team received the news. They cried, not just for the loss of their friend and leader, but for the incredible sacrifice she had made. They knew that without her, none of this would have been possible. Dr. Carter's story didn't end with her death. It lived on in the lives she saved, in the people who carried her memory, and in the hope she had given the world. She had given everything she had, and in doing so, she had changed everything. Her final message, the one she had recorded before she left, was played on news stations around the world. Her voice, calm and steady, echoed in living rooms, hospitals, and shelters everywhere. If you're watching this, it means the vaccine worked. It means the world is healing. And that's all I ever wanted. Remember, life is fragile, but it's also beautiful. Take care of each other, love each other, and never, ever lose hope. Because even in the darkest times, there's always light. You just have to keep looking for it. Dr. Elena Carter was gone, but her legacy lived on. She had given the world a second chance, and the world would never forget her. The outbreak was finally contained. It didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen without a cost. The world had been brought to its knees, and the scars it left behind would take years to heal. Families were broken, communities shattered, and the weight of so much loss hung heavy in the air. But slowly, life began to return. Streets that had been empty for months started to fill again. Schools reopened, businesses unlocked their doors, and people began to breathe a little easier. At the hospital, things were quieter now. The ER wasn't overflowing anymore, and the staff who had survived the worst of it were trying to pick up the pieces. But there was an emptiness that couldn't be ignored. Dr. Carter's absence was felt everywhere. Her colleagues missed her steady voice, her calm presence, and the way she always seemed to know what to do, even when everything was falling apart. They held a memorial for her in the hospital courtyard. It wasn't fancy, just a small gathering of the people who had worked alongside her, fought alongside her, and loved her. They shared stories about her, laughing through their tears as they remembered the way she used to bring coffee for the night shift, or how she always had a kind word for the interns who were struggling. She gave everything, one of the nurses said, her voice trembling. She didn't just save lives, she saved us. She reminded us why we do this, even when it feels impossible. Her team decided to honor her in the best way they knew how. They renamed the hospital's infectious disease wing after her, the Dr. Elena Carter Center for Hope and Healing. A plaque with her picture was placed at the entrance, and underneath it were the words she had spoken in her final message. Even in the darkest times, there's light. We just have to find it. But Dr. Carter's legacy didn't stop there. Her video messages, the ones she had recorded in her final days, were shared with the world. They went viral, spreading across social media, news channels, and even classrooms. People watched her speak, her voice calm and steady, and they found comfort in her words. She became a symbol of hope, of resilience, of what it meant to keep going even when everything seemed lost. One of the most powerful moments came when a young boy, the same boy who had held her hand in the quarantine zone, was interviewed on TV. He was healthy now, his cheeks full of color, his eyes bright. "She saved my life," he said simply. "She didn't have to, but she did. And I'll never forget her." A montage showed the ripple effects of her work. The vaccine she had delivered was now being distributed worldwide, saving millions of lives. Her research, the notes and data she had left behind, led to a breakthrough in understanding how to prevent future pandemics. Scientists built on her work, creating systems and treatments that would protect the world for generations to come. And then there were the personal stories, the lives she had touched in ways big and small. A nurse who had been on the verge of quitting was now training others, inspired by Dr. Carter's words. A grieving father who had been able to say goodbye to his wife because of her kindness was now volunteering at a support group for others who had lost loved ones. But perhaps the most poignant moment came in a quiet living room, far from the hospital and the chaos of the outbreak. Emma sat on the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest, a tablet in her hands. She was watching one of her mom's video messages, the one Dr. Carter had recorded just for her. "Hi, sweetheart," her mom's voice said, soft and warm. "I'm sorry I couldn't be there for you the way I wanted to be. But I need you to know how much I love you. You're my everything, Emma. And I know you're going to do amazing things. You're stronger than you think, and I'm so proud of you." Tears streamed down Emma's face as she watched, but there was a small smile on her lips. She paused the video, her fingers brushing over the screen, as if she could reach out and touch her mom. In the background, the sun was setting, casting a warm golden light across the room. Emma wiped her tears and pressed play again, letting her mom's voice fill the silence. The screen faded to black, and Dr. Carter's voice played one last time. "Even in the darkest times, there is light. We just have to find it." And with those words, the story ended, not with despair, but with hope. Dr. Carter was gone, but her light remained, shining in the lives she had touched, the people she had saved, and the world she had helped to heal.